first speaker this evening traveled approximately about 30 hours with layovers to get here. He's usually the one from the farthest point of the earth at each of the Shroud conferences that we're at. Rex Morgan first saw the Shroud in 1970 during the media exposition prior to its display to the general public for the first time since 1933 at that point. He also published Shroud News. I've been trying to talk him into resuming that because it was a very good newsletter about various news related to the Shroud from all around the world. He's given 15 major papers at international Shroud conferences since 1986. He did expeditions into Roman catacombs doing research related to the Shroud. He was part of the team called the Environmental Study of the Shroud in Jerusalem in 1986. And they were in a rock tomb for about 10 days, a tomb very similar to what Jesus would have been buried in research. He's written 4 books on the Shroud, edited several others. He celebrated his 50th wedding anniversary this year, 2008. He has a son who's an archaeologist. He's sort of an Indiana Jones type character. I'm so glad that he was able to make it. He's all the way from Australia and Bangkok. And I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Rex Morgan.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Joe, for that introduction. You know, whenever I speak in America, I'm tempted to think that when anyone speaks with a British accent, or for that matter, one with an Australian inflections, it's the sound and the pronunciations which intrigue the audience. So it doesn't much matter what one says. You know, it's more a matter of how one says it. But I do realise, of course, that a highly intelligent and cultured American audience like this one tonight is interested in the material that I might present, and doubtless you know more about it than I do, so minor things like the way of speaking are of no real consequence. I'm fascinated by the fact that today, the 14th of August, is the feast day of Saint Eusebius, a remarkable Greek historian and Christian, the bishop of Caesarea in Palestine, no less, who flourished from 260 AD until 339. During that time, he wrote many significant tomes: his ecclesiastical history, his history of the world, his geographical gazetteer of Palestine. And we also find his name in the index of a number of shrouds, since his work is contemporaneous with the collateral evidence that we have of the existence of the Turin Shroud in the 3rd and 4th centuries. It's hard to believe, is it not, that it was 7 years ago that I gave the keynote address in Dallas, Texas, to the International Conference that year. Indeed, some of you were there. It's also hard to believe this year of 2008 is the 110th anniversary of that pivotal and momentous occasion in Turin, Italy, when Secondo Pia made the first photographic images of the Turin Shroud, thus generating such a devastating challenge to the imagination, to the intelligence, to the faith of the world. A challenge which continues and largely unanswered to this day. And it's hard to believe that this year of 2008 is the 30th anniversary of the work of the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STIR, which discovered and reported so much information about this remarkable object, and which is still being analysed and studied as new ideas and techniques for interpretation are brought forward by the enormous and worldwide circle of Shroud scholars and scientists, who for more than a century have brought their immense resources to bear on what is one of the most studied objects in the world. how well I recall meeting many of the original members of STIRP all those years ago, and who encouraged me in my interest in the Shroud, which had begun, as Joe said, in Turin Cathedral in August 1978. It's hard to believe that 2008 is the 20th anniversary of the 1988 carbon-14 testing procedure, which propelled the Shroud onto front pages all over the world and was wickedly described by a cynical media as a fake, without any reference to the massive preponderance of evidence to the contrary. Remember the challenge of some of the gleeful headlines in the press 20 years ago? Let me remind you of some of them. Turin Shroud of forgery, says Catholic Church. From holy relic to holy red herring. Shroud confirmed as a fake. How an age of mystery ended. Holy Shroud of 1350 forgery. The unmasking of the Shroud. Shroud of Turin mystery solved. Official Shroud is a fake. Shroud of Turin was work of a medieval master forger. Tests show Shroud not linked to Christ. There were also these headlines. Shroud test inconclusive, says academic. Expert says test on Shroud was done wrongly. Shroud debate won't end. Fake Shroud report sparks row. Fake Shroud to remain a holy object. And so the challenges, 100 years of research and evidence went on ad infinitum. And it's hard to believe, isn't it, that 2008 is the 10th anniversary of the opening of that excellent new Shroud Museum in Turin. Yes, it's hard to believe that these anniversaries, the 110th, the 30th, the 20th and the 10th, are now upon us. It's hard to believe, is it not, that we could very well have in our possession in Turin, Italy, the very piece of cloth which wrapped the mortal body of the founder of Christianity. But what is not hard to believe, for those of us with open minds and even the most minimal powers of observation and common sense, irrespective of our background, our race, our religion, is that there is overwhelming evidence of all kinds to challenge that carbon-14 test, that single test. In any event, a procedure not altogether suitable for dating textile, and now, as it was then, believed by those of us who know something about the Shroud to be, in some way we couldn't explain at the time, incorrect. It was almost 30 years ago, almost to the day, that I stood outside Turin Cathedral with the world media as we waited expectantly for the doors to be thrown open to admit us to see for the first time since 1933 the famous relic so carefully guarded and preserved for centuries. I recall how, along with the cynics of the media, we went into the cathedral door, and then virtually everyone stopped in their tracks. There was, for a few moments, complete silence, apart from some intakes of breath. Some hardened media men and women sank to their knees. There before us, in a great frame, and dimly lit, was the cloth, the faint image of the man. The effect on me was immediate. I somehow felt it was the real thing. Now, I had no logical reason for thinking so. Indeed, I knew little of the Shroud, or its history then. But it seemed to be almost a self-evident truth that I was gazing upon something of exceptional and unique importance. The power, the aura, seeming to emanate from the cloth was almost tangible. And many, many people have felt and said the same thing for the 30 years since, when they have seen the Shroud, or when they've observed photographs of it on exhibition. So, what is this multifaceted enigma, this eternal challenge? How can it be that an ancient piece of cloth can evoke so much interest, so much passion, so much study, so much fascination, so much reverence, so much controversy, so much scandal, so much antagonism, and so much love? But then it's at gatherings like this that we try to answer these questions as we come together from different parts of the world in the common pursuit of the truth, where we can hear from each other, where we can learn from experts in every field of human endeavour who've been moved to apply their expertise to the Shroud in circumstances where we can also respect points of view which might differ from our own, and magnanimously rather than jealously. For the whole of the 110 years since Pierre first looked astonished at his huge glass photographic plates that night of 1898 in his Turin darkroom, the work has continued. For 110 years there has been an eternal challenge to everyone involved in the pursuit of this multifaceted enigma. For 30 years it's been a challenge to me as I've collected a vast archive of Shroud material, books, articles, movies, sound tapes, discs, artifacts, photographs. It has been a challenge as I have met and interviewed most of the 20th century Shroud scholars and writers, many of them now gone from our midst, and only for their books and their writings. It's been a challenge for me to write and produce 118 editions of the newsletter Shroud News, which I began in 1980 with a 4-page report, which expanded to a fully fledged magazine, but which I suspended in 2001, and I've been asked ever since by people all over the world to begin writing it again. And it's been a challenge to write 4 books on the subject of the Shroud, and to give major papers like this one at international conferences, and to give hundreds and hundreds of lectures and media interviews and broadcasts. And it's been a challenge to be involved in several pieces of original research over the years connected with the Shroud, upon which I've reported at conferences worldwide. So are we not fortunate indeed that people like Joe Marino and Sue Benford and the organisers of this gathering have made it their business, as have others over the years, to keep the challenge alive and to continue to evoke interest in this eternal enigma. Since the Amstar conference in Dallas in 2001 and the following one in 2005, much has continued to occur in Cincinnati, and today we are faced with as much controversy and as much new evidence for the Shroud's authenticity as we have ever been. As the spectacular 21st century advances in technology occur, so new insights into this perpetual miracle, as I called it in my first book on the subject, continue to be brought into the light and to accrue in abundance. Much has happened in our world since 2001. That Dallas conference was held just days after 9/11, that day which itself changed the world forever. And its far-reaching consequences are still being felt and dealt with 7 years later, without a conclusion being reached to relieve the people of the world of the burden of the fear of terrorism and the prospect of continuing religious wars, which have always been a factor in our so-called civilized world since time began. We live then in a difficult time where our beliefs are being challenged daily at the global level of national and international ethics, on the community level of how young people are behaving and being influenced, on the family level of whether the ties and lessons of family life even continue to exist at all, as we knew it for thousands of years, thanks to the evils of liberty without responsibility, and technology without control, and media without conscience. We live now in a world where religious activity is much reduced and greatly diluted in the mistaken belief by and promoters that this dilution will attract adherents, especially the young. It seems to me that an object like the Shroud can still be a mitigating factor in all these modern challenges as an icon for good and a factor for peace and love and harmony. So when Joe invited me to give this keynote address, to be a repeat performance of the one I gave in 2001, I decided it was a challenge I should accept, despite my relative lack of activity on the Shroud scene over the past few years. I had attended the next Dallas conference in 2005 and had intended to produce Shroud News again that year, but having been an unwilling witness to the unfortunate petulant behaviour of many at that meeting, I couldn't find it hard to do so. Nevertheless, I regard it as a great privilege to be asked again to speak as I am tonight. And I thank you for the opportunity and for the warm welcome that you've already accorded me. In 2001, I spoke at the conclusion of the conference, with the advantage of having heard most of the learned papers presented. This time I have the challenge of setting the scene for what is to follow. And I'm much impressed, as I'm sure you are, by the list of programmed speakers, many of them old friends, and the variety of topics that they'll be submitting for our earnest consideration. Once again, we are provided with a magnificent opportunity for information exchange and the expression of our ideas, our research, our hypotheses, the results we've achieved, and most importantly, I believe, our celebration of friendship and the spirit of common purpose which binds us, reflecting those intangible qualities which are revealed whenever we come together, wherever in the world it might be, to share our knowledge and our work regarding this multifaceted enigma, this extraordinary object, this spiritual mystery, the Shroud. And I would also like to say how much we've always appreciated the work behind the scenes of Barry Schwartz, who will be here, of course, for every minute of every part of this conference, doing all the technical things. It's very encouraging to see the range of topics and speakers that we're to experience in the next few days. And as you know, we're going to hear about STIR, or we were going to, Oviedo, the VPA, visibility, spectroscopy, digital analysis, image formation, the coins, botany, corona discharge, pollens, the blood, history, carbon-14, the mending, chemistry, causes of death, holography, restoration, religion, and others. And I can tell you, too, that the people of my own adopted country, Australia, continue to stand firmly at America's side, ready to take up the challenges which lie ahead, facing all free peoples in ridding the world of brutal terrorism. And conferences like this one bring strength to the message of hope in the world at this time. An essential message which shows us that good does eventually win out over evil in the end, and that what we know to be good and right will endure in the world. The message of inspiration of the Shroud itself is surely proof enough of that. This conference represents another pivotal moment in the history of the Shroud, for we are given the opportunity to take stock of the events in Shroud history of the past 2 millennia, and of syndonology in the past 11 decades, and in particular the most recent years of this 21st century. We're also given the opportunity to look forward, to redefine our hopes and dreams as Shroud researchers in the light of what we have already learnt about the Shroud. We have a unique opportunity, and many are already embracing it, to advance with a fresh outlook, a renewed spirit, a strengthened desire to work together, asking the questions of science, religion, history and art, which might yet reveal answers to the unresolved issues of the Shroud. In February 1997, I wrote the 100th issue of Shroud News, and in it I wrote of my own Shroud odyssey, as I called it, which began, as I said, in Turin in August 78, when I first saw the Shroud, the day before the public were admitted into the cathedral for that great exposition. And that odyssey became more and more intense as the years went on. It became a commitment, a passion, for me to continue to bring out Shroud News. The first issue appeared in September 1980. I watched the subscription list grow and widen to embrace people in countries all over the world. I noted at that time that I had no real editorial policy, no mission statement of any significance, no editorial board with individuals forcing their opinions on the publication, no initial requirement for peer review, therefore not preventing an important immediacy of information, no deadline to meet, apart from the approximate bi-monthly production, and no pretensions about being a scholarly or scientific or prestigious publication. For these reasons, Shroud News became a success and filled a void in communication amongst Shroudies all over the world. It was very evident to me at the outset that effective communication is and always will be a key to the success and viability of syndonology as a whole. Now, this observation was further borne out by several tangential developments which followed. Some years ago, for example, the British Society for the Jury in Shroud, led then by Ian Wilson, adopted both the same format and a similar policy as Shroud News, thus rendering his work and that of the British Society even more useful, accessible, and therefore complementary to my own newsletter, which had become, in the English-speaking part of the world, Syndonology, an apparently useful, and I'm glad to say welcome device for communication. This work has been competently continued by Mark Guskin in Portugal, and I might add that since I suspended the publication of Shroud News, Guskin's newsletter is one of the very few publications anyone now sends me, apart from the excellent Spanish magazine Lintium, the Turin propaganda sheet Sindone, and Wanger's CSST News. All the others have abandoned me, and most of my regular correspondents have stopped writing. One hasn't seen such publications as the Italian Il Telo, or the Collegamento Sindone of Emanuele Marini's group, or the Cielt newsletter from France. The further and very contemporary example of this need for effective communication among Shroud scholars can be observed in the remarkable development and significance of the really superb internet website generated over thousands of hours by Barry Schwartz in the last few years, which brings immediacy to the current news and developments among technologists and provides access to our work for the interested general public all over the world. The websites of Schwartz and the others which have been developed since are essential to the sharing of information as our collective research programs continue in the new millennium. You know, back in 1997 I also said, and I quote, "If the anti-Shroud crusade and skeptics their absurd theories, and if the world media, ever keen for a scandal and for negative reporting, had not taken up, for example, the forgery story of Walter McCrone, who was unleashed into the Shroud world by none other than Ian Wilson at a meeting in London, and continued to beat it up for the entire period since 1980, then perhaps the intensity with which those of us who had read all the other research and who understand the implications of the enormous preponderance of evidence for probable authenticity would not have occurred." And I also said, "I have no personal reason for wanting the Shroud to be genuine, and whilst I've always been ready to be convinced that it's a fake, no one has been able to so convince me by outweighing that vast body of evidence to the contrary. It's a fascinating journey," I said, "delving into the numerous areas of research and interest. I've been able to meet and befriend many of the world's great Syndonologists, and then through Shroud News to pay tribute to the large number of them who died during the period. Many of us can remember the wonderful personalities of Syndonology with admiration and affection. Others amongst you know only the names. Such great Shroud researchers and enthusiasts who departed during the 20th century, almost all of whom I met, such as, and do you remember them, Don Piero Quiraborga, Giovanni Tamburelli, Dr. Jean Vaucranger, Professor Max Fry, King Umberto II of Italy, Professor Jerome Lejeune, Monsignor Quilio Ricci, Group Captain Lord Cheshire, Dr. David Willis, Father Peter Rinaldi, Claire McAllister White, Werner Bult, Gilbert Race, Rodney Hoare, Hilda Leinen, Max Fry, Baron Stratton-Walle, Adam Otterbein, Father Adam Otterbein, Cardinal Anastasia Balestrero, Dr. John Heller, Father Frank Files, Roger Apple, Anna Hulbert, Alan Heller, Don Lynn, and Bob Butler, to mention just a few. And then those who died since we last met include Edward Hall, Walter McCrone, Brother Michael Bottigier, Frank Tribby, Ray Rogers, Bob Diniger, Kim Dreisbach, Don Luigi Fossati, Luigi Ganella, Audrey Dimmock, Daniel Raffat de Briand, Marcia Maschia, Antoine Legrand at 98, just recently, Pope John Paul II, Ronald Jenkins, Silvano Scanaroni, Eugenia Natowski, Norma Weller, Walter Abbott. But it's good that some of the great names of Syndonology are not only still alive, but with us at this conference. And I think of some of you, like Antonacci and Benford and Braille and Dunnin and Devo and Fanti, Maloney, Marino, Mark Ward, McPherson, Horario, Porter, Scavone, Schumacher, Schwartz, Stevenson, Wanger, to mention just a few of you. And the ones I've left out, I apologise. You're just as important. The first great generation of 20th century Shroudies has then virtually disappeared. Now, I belong to the second wave, and I'm certainly no longer young. My earnest hope, shared by many others, is that we shall find enough of the third wave of Syndenologists, some of you who are here, to persist with the work and carry on the continuing quest for more information, investigation and discussion about the most fascinating mystery in the world. When we gathered here, all of like mind, think back over the past 20 or 30 years, and further back indeed to the dawning of the scientific age for the Shroud of Turin, which began with Pierre and his massive cumbersome plate camera in 1898, I think that we all agree that one of the most rewarding aspects of the exercise has been in those friendships and collaborations which we have made along the way. And this is particularly true for me, as I've had the opportunity of moving freely amongst the worldwide Shroud circle for many years. There is, as with most fields of study, a special affinity which is manifest among those of the mindset. There are also to be observed, unfortunately, the less noble human failings of academic jealousies, backbiting, personal vendettas, scandals, and in some cases near criminal activity, which attends upon all intensive and passionate human behaviour. I've tried to keep clear of these, and I hope I've been successful, apart from frustration or annoyance, which I might have caused occasionally in my writings to those lightweights who can't face candour. I've had the great pleasure and privilege of attending and giving papers at many international Shroud conferences. I've managed to write several books on the subject and to be involved in one way or another with the production of others. And I've given countless on the Shroud to public groups. I've, in fact, since 1982, also controlled the original Brooks Institute photographic exhibition, which was based on the 1978 research work in Turin, and I've added to and enhanced the exhibit. It has been seen by nearly 750,000 people in many countries since that time, and I've enjoyed the challenge of doing several pieces of original research, and have been a member of a number of visionary teams undertaking research in the field of one kind or another. And added to that, I've already mentioned the production of Shroud News, my humble newsletter. But my intention tonight, as it was back in 2001, is to remind us of several themes which link the past century of Shroud research to the century which lies ahead. And I'll offer you a synopsis of just some of the landmark events which have shaped Syndenology in that time. I shall mention just some of the outcomes of our research in order to demonstrate what is fairly certain today. And I'll present a view of the radiocarbon polemic. I'll present an overview of the key issues which we must embrace in the next 100 years of Syndenology. And I shall call upon active Shroudies to maintain their passion and their resolve to continue in the great challenge of unlocking the mysteries of this remarkable Shroud of Turin. As a prelude to considering the challenges of the future and to put into perspective the present, let us ponder then briefly some of the major events which have shaped Syndenology in the scientific era of Shroud history, which began in 1898. So in that year, Pierre's photographs revealed the Shroud image to have the same characteristics as the photographic negative. These remarkable images are still available for our inspection. And just think of the implications if digital photography had existed then, instead of positive negative film. In 1902, the first modern scientific paper on the subject of the Shroud was presented to the Academy of Sciences in Paris by Professor of Anatomy Yves Delage, who argued for the medical and general scientific plausibility of the Shroud image. In 1931, 2 million visitors flocked to see the exposition of the Shroud in Turin. Giuseppe Henri photographed it, and Secondo Pio was there as well, as were scientists of the French Academy. In that same year, Dr. Pierre Barbet conducted experiments to reconstruct the Passion of Jesus as exhibited in the Shroud image, work later updated by Dr. Fred Zagaby, Gus Acheta, Ricci and others. 1933, Father Peter Rinaldi attended the exposition of the Shroud. I well recall him talking of this on many occasions. And Barbet, through direct, close observation, realised The blood stains were derived from direct contact between the cloth and the body. In 1933, Henriet took his photographs of the Shroud, and many think they are still the best black and whites ever taken. I'm sorry, Barry. In 1938, Paul Vignon, who'd studied the Shroud for many years, published the most definitive book on the subject at that time, and much of our later work has been in verifying the hypotheses put forward by him. In 1939, the first International Congress on Shroud Studies was held in Turin, at which 20 papers were presented, and which was the forerunner of all international conferences such as this one here in Columbus. From 1939 until 1946, the Shroud was kept in a secret location away from Turin during the Second World War. In 1951, the Holy Shroud Guild was formed in New York, and I even received one newsletter from them in the past 6 years. In 1954, Group Captain Leonard Cheshire toured Britain with a photographic exhibition about the Shroud based on Henriet's photographs. And in 1959, the formation took place at the Centro Internazionale di Sindonologica in Turin. In 1960, the British Shroud enthusiast Vera Barclay first raised the idea of the viability of radiocarbon dating of the Shroud with the Atomic Energy Research Establishment in Hartlepool in the UK. And in 1969, Cardinal Pellegrino initiated an examination of the Shroud to study its state of preservation by a team of experts. In the same year, the Shroud was photographed by Giovanni Battista Giudica Cordelia in colour for the first time, and again in black and white, and by Woods Light and Ultraviolet. I well recall seeing all his original work in his Turin studio some years ago. In 1972, an attempt was made to destroy the Shroud by an arsonist. In 1973, the Shroud was exhibited for television for the first time, and a group of international Sindonologists was able to examine it. This included the removal of a significant sample by Professor Gilbert Reyes and the removal of 12 adhesive tape samples by Dr. Max Fry. And of course, the Reyes sample come into new significance in recent times. In 1976, Dr. John Jackson and Bill Motton reviewed a Shroud image through the VP8 image analyzer invented by Dr. Peter Schumacher, who's here, for the first time revealing the three-dimensionality of the image. In 1976, Max Fry demonstrated that some columns found on the Shroud were unique to Israel. In 1977, Father Rinaldi, Father Ollivine, Socks, Robinson, Rolfe, Jackson and many others met at the first United States Conference of Research on the Shroud. And the Shroud of Turin research project, the STIRP team, later evolved as a result of this meeting. In the same year, the Reverend David Socks of the newly formed British Society of the Turin Shroud contacted Harry Gove about dating the Shroud, Gove having pioneered accelerator mass spectrometry in the same year, and Socks, who was later to desert the Shroud. In 1977, a Shroud symposium was held in London, at which Jackson, Jumper, Fry, McCrone, Rinaldi, Ollivine, Ricci and Kawira Borga all spoke, amongst others, and a significant conference was also held in Albuquerque. In 1978, Cardinal Balestrero announced a Shroud exposition and an international conference for later in the year. That, of course, was the year the team, which became the STIRP team, met in Colorado Springs and again in Connecticut to plan specific testing of the Shroud. Harry Gove met Edward Hall of Oxford to discuss carbon dating of the Shroud. The second international symposium was held in 1978. Ian Wilson's book became the most significant book on the Shroud on the subject to that date, in which his hypothesis that the folded shroud of the frame Mendelian of Odessa are one and the same. In October 1978, STIRP carried out its extensive battery of tests. A complete photographic study was undertaken by Vernon Miller and Barry Schwartz and Ernie Brooks, amongst others. An research program was undertaken by Fry, Ricci, Bima Bologna, Gonella and others. Ray Rogers took 32 samples of particulate matter removed from the Shroud surface by Fry to microscopist Walter McClone. In 1979, the significant Oscar-winning film The Silent Witness was released by David Rolfe. In the same year, Father Frank Fire identified the coin images on the eyes, subsequently to be rendered in 3D by Jackson and Jumper, and the later work by Fontenelle and others. In the same year, Harry Gove formally offered to carbon date the Shroud. In 1980, I proposed in my first book the testing of DNA from the shroud. In 1981, the Brooks Institute exhibited photographic material from the 1978 study and subsequently toured that exhibition. In 1981, Jackson, Schwalbe, Ganella, Olivine and Rinaldi visited ex-King Umberto of Italy to report their findings of the Stirp investigation. In 1981, Dorothy Crispino inaugurated Shroud Spectrum International, probably the most prestigious Shroud journal ever produced, but since then regrettably defunct. In 1983, King Umberto died and the Shroud was bequeathed to the Vatican in the care of the Pope and his successors. In 1984, Jackson and de Mahala presented Cardinal Balestrero with proposals for further scientific work on the Shroud. In 1986, the US Shroud Group, the Association of Scholars and Scientists International for the Shroud of Turin, was formed, and Paul Maloney received 5 of the Fry pollen samples which were examined by a Shroud conference in Pennsylvania. In 1986, a Shroud Symposium was organised by William Meacham in Hong Kong, attracting papers by Wilson, Ganella, Rinaldi, Heller and Adler, and at which I also exhibited the Brooks photographic exhibit, by then under my control, and it drew over 1 million people in Hong Kong. In 1986, Wanger and Wanger demonstrated their polarised image overlay technique, which revolutionised the iconographic study of the Shroud face and other parts of the image. In 1986, the environmental study of the Shroud in Jerusalem, of which I was a member, led by Dr. Eugenia Natowski, was conducted in a tomb complex under Jerusalem. In 1988, samples were cut from the Shroud for carbon-14 testing. Rigi also took blood samples and retained a portion of the cut Shroud material. In the same year, 88, Fry's entire collection of samples became the property of ASSIST. These were examined by Dr. Alan Adler and others, revealing plant and floral debris and more pollens. In 1988, in August 1988, I recall being at a private Shroud Group meeting at Dorothy Crispino's home when Rinaldi telephoned, gravely disturbed that he had been told that the carbon dating results were likely to be a medieval date. In August 88, the London Evening Standard had got hold of this information and declared the Shroud to be a fake made in 1350. And in October 1988, the results of the carbon dating were smugly announced by Hall as 1260 to 1390 exclamation mark. In 1989, the International Shroud Symposium was held in Bologna, Italy, and the first French Sielt Shroud Symposium was held in Paris. And in 1990, a conference was held in Cagliari in Italy. And in 1991, Isabel Picek showed conclusively that the image cannot be any kind of painting. In 1991, an International Shroud Symposium was held in St. Louis, Missouri, the proceedings of which, remarkably, were produced the same year, and that was organised by Joe Marino and Father Aaron Bellard. In 1992, 5 textile experts examined the Shroud, including Landy, Fleury Lemberg, Carlomoni, Diana and Guidi. In 1993, Garza Valdez examined the Shroud sample retained by Rigi, leading to his observations of bioplastic coating on the fibres. In the same year, 1993, the second Paris organised Shroud Symposium was held in Rome. And in 1993, Stirp was formally dissolved. The Shroud was removed from the Guarini Chapel for restoration work of the building. In 1995, expositions of the Shroud to be held in 1998 and 2000 were announced by Cardinal Saldarini. And in 1995, Saldarini also declared that any Shroud samples other than those taken with official permission in 1978 are unauthorised and asked for their return to the Holy See. In 1995, Barry Schwartz created the first major Shroud website. In 1997, the Shroud was dramatically rescued from certain destruction in the burning and collapsing Turin Cathedral by hero fireman Mario Trematore. The Shroud was examined and found to be undamaged. In 1997, the third Paris Symposium was held, and in 1998, an exposition of the Shroud took place, as did an international Shroud Symposium in Turin, and included several important exhibitions of Shroud-related material, including the highly significant collection of ex-King Umberto II of Savoy, Pier's original photographic plates from 1898, and other important artefacts associated with Sintonology. saw the first conference in Dallas. In May 1999, an interesting conference on relics, including the Shroud and allied cloths, was held in Rome, at which Her Royal Highness Princess Maria Gabriella of Savoy gave a significant paper on the Savoy collection. Also in 1999, an international Shroud conference in Richmond, Virginia was held, and that included an exhibition of Richard Orario's collection of Shroud items. In 2000, the Shroud was again on exposition, and a scientific congress was held in Turin to discuss the past, present and future of the Shroud. A lot of us remember that one quite well. In 2000, a one-week examination of the Shroud took place by a group of Italian scientists. The underside of the cloth was examined by Suardo with a scanner presided over by Ghiberti, which confirmed what had been observed by Stirp in 1978, but which apparently gained also gained other data. In the year 2000, an international Shroud conference was held at Orvieto in Italy, and another was held in Vienna. And Swinehardt's theory of lightning causing the poker holes and alignment with Oviedo was published. In 2001, the Shroud was placed in a new storage arrangement and kept flat in a chamber filled with an inert gas to assist in its long-term conservation. And in 2001, we met for the second international conference in Dallas. Ciel held its fourth Paris symposium, and Mr. Heisman made a brief amateur foray into the catacombs to pour scorn on my years of work on the earliest portrait of Christ, which my three scientific editions had identified. This conference also, though, had 48 papers listed, and only a few of which were by lightweights or crackpots. In 2002, the Turin authorities undertook major restoration work on the Shroud, chiefly by Matilda Fleury-Lemberg, resulting in an international outcry which continues, as we know, to this day. In 2003, Isabel Picek was commissioned to adorn the front of the new sarcophagus of the Shroud in St. John's Cathedral. And in the same year, members of the Savoy family visited the Shroud. And a fictional work raised the issue of cloning from Christ's blood, a matter which I'd actually first raised in my book of 1980, and it didn't make any friends. In 2004, Fanti's suggested image seen on the backside of the cloth shows that the image could not have been faked. In 2005, the third international conference was held in Dallas, and William Meacham, the eminent archaeologist and syndenologist, published his book, The Rape of the Turin Shroud, which condemned the restoration work of 2002. In 2006, Dorothy Crispino turned 90. And she survives to this day. And the National Geographic published a major article on the Gospel of Judas. In the same year, in Turin, a special Shroud exhibit was displayed to coincide with the Winter Olympics. And Zagaby published a major critique of medical inaccuracies in the movie The Passion of the Christ. In 2006, a liturgical Shroud conference was held in Turin, at which 22 papers, mostly Italian, but also French, German, and Mike Miner from the USA were presented. In 2006, Soons produced the first hologram of the image. In the same year, the Pope visited the Manapillo cloth, which had been Pfeiffer's life work. In that same year, Australian Brendan Whiting published an up-to-date major work on the Shroud, and it's an exceptionally good book. In 2007, Barry Schwartz presented a major exhibit of his material in 4 cities in the Philippines. And in the same year, Vernon Miller of Stirp gave all his original 1978 images to Amstar. And there was a convention in Valencia, Spain, and DNA on the blood on the Oviedo cloth were carried out. And in the same year, Diana published very good research on the missing years, claiming France to be where the Shroud was between 1300 and 1357, contrary to my Templecombe theory. In 2007, Jackson persuaded Oxford to reconsider carbon monoxide contamination of the C14 sample site. And then there was also the proposal by Jones in 2007 to carbon date the pollens. And in the same year, the new Holy Face complex in Turin was completed. And this year in 2008, David Rolfe's BBC documentary was shown, narrated by a Muslim and thus drawing severe criticism from Ian Dickinson of Canterbury. In 2008, Barry Schwartz set up a non-profit organisation to perpetuate his website. And in this same year, the shroud was removed from its location to check the integrity of the protective case, and the high definition pictures were taken. And a high definition image of the shroud was also on display this year in Sydney during the visit of the Pope for World Week. And this year, the completion of the Holy Face complex in Turin, where the back wall of the apse has stone tiles set such that the shroud face is visible from a distance, but the image disappears when close to it, as it does with the shroud itself. So now, as we move into the 21st century, thanks to the contributions of a very large number of Syndologists and associated researchers of the first and second waves, some definitive statements can be made about the shroud, its images, and the evidence contained in and upon it. And it's worth drawing attention in giving these statements to the published proceedings of the International Scientific Symposium, which was held by invitation only in Turin in March 2000, under the auspices of the Centro Internazionale di Sindonologia. And this volume is one of the most rapidly produced of any Shroud Conference proceedings that I can remember, eclipsing in production even that one from St. Louis in 1991. That significant gathering in Turin, which also included a private hour-long examination of the shroud itself for that select group, produced some very perceptive and valuable presentations and discussions, which set a useful benchmark in shroud research as we determined the course of future priorities. Further to this important conference, others have continued to be held, which reflect the current focus and progress of different areas of contemporary shroud research in all its multifaceted fields, by those like you and me and many others all over the world. We must remember that statements we make about the shroud, based on the huge corpus of knowledge which has been amassed over the last 110 years, are mostly polemical. They are open to varying degrees of argument and varying methods of validation, for, as all of us know, there are potentially about as many opinions about each characteristic of the shroud and as many opinions about each hypothesis accounting for these characteristics as there are shroud researchers living and working throughout the world. Our late friend Al Adler, in his last published work, pointed out that the validation of scientific conclusions differs from the criteria applied to historical arguments, in that in science, hypotheses must be tested by a reproducible experiment. He reminded us that scientific studies cannot establish the authenticity of the shroud, but its disauthenticity. He noted that in testing of hypotheses by experiment, the investigator must carry out enough measurements to establish precision and enough control experiments to distinguish which of all reasonable, possible, testable explanations best fits all the data. He said, scientific truth becomes a matter of relative probabilities to which one approximates by continued application of the scientific method, utilising further testable hypotheses and experiments. Now, these statements are supported and reiterated frequently in the contemporary literature as a response to the scene many of us observed at the huge international symposium in Turin in 1998, at which some quite ridiculous and unsubstantiated and unverifiable papers were put forward from the extreme outer fringes of syndonology. Although we must bear in mind that everyone who submitted a proposed paper that year was sincere in their beliefs and was accepted without question to that conference, although, as I recall, some of our esteemed and legitimate colleagues in syndonology packed up and went home in disgust when some of the lightweights took to the podium. I must look around and make sure that no one's doing that here. Oh, sorry. Another of our Shroud friends, John Jackson, surely one of the best analytical minds of the second wave of syndonologists, has commented that it's only through careful application of the scientific method, which relies ultimately upon empirical observation, that we can focus on the correct scientific explanation and resolve contradictory hypotheses, many of which about the shroud. And regarding the criteria used in historical argument as opposed to scientific method, Adler had pointed out that reasonable theories, well supported by a great deal of varied historic, artistic, iconographic and other circumstantial evidence, although remaining polemical, are regarded as acceptable in the determination of shroud history. But Ghiberti of Turin identifies a greater problem, takes a harder line. He states we must work on the problem of, he says, the force of habit and conceit in presuming to know, holding sway over contact with serious primary sources. and he calls on the need to rigorously verify on an incontrovertible documentary basis historical descriptions which are made. Jackson further indicates that some of the most compelling historical arguments are based on direct scientific observations of aspects of the Shroud itself. The way forward, he suggested, is through the coupling together of scientific method through empirical observation with the historical data supported by strong circumstantial evidence, which, although in the crucial period before 1350 remains polemical, will hopefully produce a convincing and satisfying history of the Shroud from its origin until the present. To guide us into continuing research, let me now recall some of the main definitive statements of empirical fact and of near certainty, albeit polemical, that can, in my opinion, be confidently made about the Shroud as a result of the combined interdisciplinary approaches of scientific, historical, artistic, religious, iconographic and other fields of study over the last 110 years. Each of these statements, dare I say, with its own separately evolved methodology for validation, their differences being perhaps a catalyst for many of the greatest disagreements, exclusions, arguments, and jealousies, which have occasionally, but perhaps in the long run, beneficially punctuated the work of syntonology in the past. It is obviously beyond the scope of this paper to cover all the detail which can be derived from the huge corpus of published Shroud research, so I'm only able to touch upon some of the key arguments and observations to at least give an indication of where we appear to stand and which will guide our thinking as we contemplate syntonology in the 21st century. We have a quite clear understanding of the nature of the cloth itself. We know with absolute certainty that the major part of the Shroud was manufactured from flax to become a linen cloth in herringbone twill weave and is widely